Hello folks, our game is coming along really well now and we've got a lot of the core mechanics in place. What I'd like to add next is a way for the player to actually move on from this level and go into the next level. Here I am inside my level 1 scene, which has my level root node and then all of the other bits like the tile map, the enemies and the collectibles. I left a little gap over here which is supposed to be my exit. And what I want to do first is add some kind of marker over here to make it obvious that this is where the player needs to go. The asset pack that I'm using for this includes this little flag animation, and I think this will work really well for the exit marker. All of the assets and the project files are linked in the video description. I need to load those images into my folder structure, so I'm going to go into the file system here, into assets, images, my tile map, and then I will just drag over the flag animation into it. The flag is a sprite sheet with multiple individual frames, so for that I need to use an animated sprite 2D node. I'm going to make it directly inside of my level root. It's not really complicated enough to have its own scene. So I'll create a child node and search for an animated sprite 2D. I'll rename that node to be the flag, and then I can create a set of sprite frames for it. So I click here again, and I will click this button here to add frames from a sprite sheet. Then I can navigate to my assets, images, tile map, and select my checkpoints flag. This flag has 10 frames, so horizontally I'm going to select 10, and then vertically there's only one tile up and down. So that splits them nicely into individual frames. I can select all of them from left to right and add them to my animation. I should be able to see it popping up on the top left corner here. So let's first of all increase the scale as with everything else up to 3. And that's actually a little bit too big, so let's go with 2 instead. That looks a lot better. So now I've got the scale correct, but it's still really fuzzy. So we go into texture, filter, and change that to nearest. Now I need to increase the frame rate for my animation because right now if I play it, it's really slow. So I increase this up to 20. And if I run it again, the animation is much smoother and a lot faster. I also need to make sure that this animation plays immediately. So I'm going to click this button here to autoplay the default animation as soon as the flag is loaded. And lastly, I just need to position it near the exit. This flag doesn't need to have any collision or anything like that. It's really just a marker so the player knows where to go. Let's press F5 to run the whole game, and now I can see the flag animating in the top right, so it's really obvious that that is going to be the target and the exit. However, by itself, this doesn't actually allow the player to go on to the next level. I need a way of detecting that I've gone through this little gap and gone off the edge of the map. And I will do that in the same way as I have with detecting collisions with the enemies and the apples. I will use an area 2D node. So we'll create a new child node here, which is area 2D, and rename that to be exit. But an area 2D node does need to have a collision shape. Right now it's just this little crosshair over here. So I right click and add a child node to that, which is collision shape 2D. Now we need to actually give it a collision shape, which I'm going to use a rectangle for. I need to be careful here by dragging this into the correct place. If I was to just move this on its own, I'll move the collision shape, but the exit stays where it is. So I'm going to undo that, and instead I'm going to come up here and select group. Now when I move this, I'm going to move the whole exit node. So I drag it over to where my exit should be, and then I can adjust the size of this collision shape. So let me select this here and just drag it out to basically cover the entirety of the exit. I could drag it in a little bit as well, I suppose, but the main thing is I don't want to leave any gaps for the player to accidentally fall through without triggering this exit. Now I need to detect when the player actually goes into this exit area. The way I can do this is heading over into my exit area 2D node, going into the node tab here, and then selecting the appropriate signal. The signal that I would need to use is body entered, because that tells me when a character 2D body, which is my player, enters this space. But if I was to try and connect this, I can only go as high up as the parent of this scene, which is level root. The actual logic though needs to be handled inside of my main node, which is one level above the level root. I could simply chain my signals and have this body entered signal go into my level root, and then there I can emit a second signal that then links into the main root, but that gets a little bit messy. So instead, I'm going to manually link up the signals inside of my code. And I've previously done that with the apples and the enemies, so it shouldn't be too different. If I head over to my main script and scroll up to where I'm setting up my level here, I already do this process for the apples and for the enemies. Right at the top then, I can do pretty much the same thing. I can type connect exit, and then let me just copy this down to avoid having to type it all out again. So we'll say var exit is equal to level root node, which is this node here, dot get node or null. And the node that I'm looking for is called exit. It's this node here. So I rename apples to exit. I'll then say if exit, meaning that there is actually an exit node in this level. Then I take that exit node and I connect the signal, which is body entered. So I type out body underscore entered dot connect. This will take that signal and connect it into my main node. And then inside these brackets, I need to put the function that's going to trigger whenever the player hits the exit, which I will call on exit body entered. This immediately gives me an error because there is no function called onExitBodyEntered. So I scroll down to where I have my signal handlers, and I'm going to create a second one, which is that function. It's going to be onExitBodyEntered. Inside this function, I need to pass an argument. So if I go back and select this exit node and hover over body entered, you'll see that inside the brackets, it says body node2D. So when this signal is emitted, it also sends the name of the body that has collided with it. That means that we need to receive it here by saying body is a node2D type. The function doesn't return anything, so we just say void at the end, and then we can do a couple of things. We can print out the body, and then we can increase the level. We haven't actually defined the level variable yet, so I need to go back up to the top where I'm defining my score variable, and just above that I will say var level is an integer starting at level 1. So let's run this and see what happens. And immediately it prints something out. It says tile map layer, which means it's detected a collision already, but with the wrong thing. The reason that's happened is because there's a tiny little overlap between my collision body and the tile map here. But I only want to detect collision between the player and this exit, which means that back in my script, I need to add an additional condition here. When I get this collision, I need to check if it's the player or not. I will say if body.name is equal to player, which is the name of my character node, then it's okay. We can increase the level, and let's just confirm that it works by printing out the level variable. This way we will only act if the player is the one that's collided with the exit. If I run it again, I'm not getting any text output to say that the level has increased, which means that we're still getting the same collision from before, but it's not actually doing anything. But as soon as the player has gone into that area, the level is increased to 2. So that part is working. However, I can leave and go back in and just keep changing the level number. This could develop into a little bug if the player just touches the exit, quickly goes back, and then goes back in again. It will allow it to essentially skip a level. To fix that, I'm going to add another flag into my player. So I head over to the player script, and at the top, I currently have the alive flag, which is changed whenever the player comes into contact with an enemy. But let's add another one, which is can_move. And we'll set that to true by default. And what we can then do inside of the physics process function is we find the section that actually moves the player, which is all of this stuff here after handle jump. This is where I take keyboard input. So I will add another section just above here, which will say if can_move. As long as the player is able to move, then we can take inputs, jump, move around, and so on. And let me get rid of this so we can see the entire code block. So all of this down here needs to be indented inside of that function. And then back inside of my main script, as soon as we have this contact and the player exits, we increase the level, we print it out, and we also take that body, which is the player, take the can_move variable and set it to false, which essentially freezes the player in position. And let's test this out again. So everything starts off normal, and I'm going to run over to the exit. But as soon as I hit the exit, I should then freeze. Now the player is still in this animation, but I can't actually move with the keyboard anymore. So the player is now stuck where he is. Now we can actually set up more levels for the player to run through. The easiest way to do that is just to take the existing level, because all of the structure is pretty much there, and then save it as another one. So I can save it here inside of my levels folder as level 2. This will copy over pretty much everything that I already had, but I can edit this level. I can move the enemies around, I can move the apples around, I can add or delete some of these nodes, and I can redraw the tile map completely to change the level entirely. So have a go at this yourself and create another level. And this is what my second level looks like. If you like, you can pause the video here and copy this level, or you can just download it from the project files in the description. But really, you don't have to have the same level as me, so it would be good practice for you to create your own one. The main thing is that you have your player positioned somewhere and that you have an exit node. Now that we have this level, the player has somewhere to go. Make sure that the scene is saved as level 2 because we're going to use that variable inside of the scene name. We head back into the main script and we need to create a function that's going to handle level loading. Right now we've got one for setting up the level, but all this does is connect all of our signals. We need another one that clears the existing level and loads the new one. So I'm going to group those two functions together and add a little comment up here, which will mark out that this is the level management section. And while I'm tidying this up, I'm actually going to delete this process function because we don't need that one. Now, just above my setup level function, I'll create a new one, which is going to be load level. And for now, this only needs to take one argument, which is the level number, and that's going to be an integer. The function doesn't return anything, so we add void at the end. And now we need to figure out the logic for how we're going to load our level. Although we have different scenes, like level 1 and level 2, they all have the same overall structure, which begins with a level root parent node. And that node is the same one that's here underneath our main node. That means that the first thing we need to do is actually delete the level that's there before we can load the second one. Otherwise, we'll have two levels in the same place. But if we want to delete this, then we need to access that node. Previously, we've done that with this line up here, which accesses our score label, and we've used it in other places too. But it's also possible to do the same thing inside of the ready function. So what I will do inside my ready function, as soon as this node is configured, I will add a comment here to say set up the level. And I will assign a variable which will be current level underscore root is equal to get node level root. So it's going to take this level root node and assign it into this variable so that I can access it later on. Then inside of load level, we can use this variable, this current level root, and we can delete it because we're switching to a new level. So first, to avoid any errors, we want to check that the variable exists. We'll say if current level root. If it does exist, then we pass q underscore free, which will delete this node as soon as it's safe to do so. But this immediately gives us some errors because the variables that I've defined are inside of functions. So they're local variables and they only exist inside of each individual function. That's what the error is saying. It's not declared in the current scope. I need to declare this variable inside of my overall script. That way, all of these functions can see it, access it, and modify it. Up here, we'll say current level root is a node, and it starts off with a value of null. So that gets rid of the current level. Now we need to load the next one. So we'll add a comment here to say change level. To load the level, we need to know where it is inside of our file structure. So we need to get the level path by saying var level path is equal to, and I can just drag over one of these levels into here. And that tells me the direct path all the way from the root. So it's in resources, scenes, levels, and level 1. However, I don't want to hard code this number. I need this to be linked into my level variable up here so that it changes every time the player moves on to the next level. We'll delete that number and replace it with %s. And after this quotation mark, we'll add another percentage and say level underscore number. That level number is the argument that we pass into this function. That gives us the path so that we can actually find this individual scene, but now we need to load that scene. And that's going to go into our previous variable, this current level root. So we've just deleted it. Now we can create a new version of it. So the current level root now becomes this new level, which is going to be done by loading it at the level path. So we take this variable level path, we load the scene from it, and lastly, we need to instantiate that scene. What we're doing here is essentially the same as when I right click on my main node and select instantiate child scene, but instead I'm doing it in code. So once I've loaded and instantiated it, I need to add it as a child of my main node. And we do that by saying add underscore child the current level root. Whichever level scene we've just loaded becomes a child of our main node, and it gives us this structure back. And then we just want to rename that current level node to be called level root. I made a little typo here, so I need to actually change the name of it, not the level root itself. But the problem is that now that I've changed to a new level, all of my previous signals from my exit, the apples, and the enemies, they're all going to be gone because they were attached to my original level root. They were hard-coded. So that means that I need to use this function and slightly change what's happening inside of it. I can no longer just reference this node directly, because once this node is deleted, all of these references will go with it. I have to replace this with a variable which I will call level root. Now I can take that variable and replace all of these with the same one. It does immediately say that that variable doesn't exist, so we're going to pass it as an argument. We'll say that level root is here and it is a node. Now to complete this link, we no longer call setup level from our ready function. Instead, we call this setup level from our load level function right at the end. And inside of it, the variable that we pass is our current level root. And back inside the ready function, where we just got rid of setup level, instead we're going to call load level. Inside the brackets, we pass the level variable, and that should now complete the loop. That means that as soon as we start the game, we're going to actually delete the level root that's already there. Then we reload it because we're still on level 1, and then we call the setup level function, which is where we reconnect all of the different nodes. The final step before we can test this out is to also call load level whenever we move on to the next level, which happens inside this function here. So when the player exits the level, we increase the level by 1, we freeze the player in place, and then we need to load the next level. So here we just pass in this updated level variable. We made a lot of structural changes to the script there, so let's run the game again and see what happens. It starts off with a good sign. Everything loaded in. We know that what's actually happened is that the game loaded, it deleted this level and then loaded it back in again. But now let's go to level 2 and everything worked pretty well. We're on to our next level. It's loaded in and reconnected the signals from the players, the apples and the enemies, and I should be able to die and get my confirmation. So everything worked pretty well, but notice that the debugger is really unhappy. I'm getting a lot of errors here. And a lot of that is because I'm loading and saving nodes on the fly. So I need to be a lot more careful with what is happening when I'm calling these different functions. And we've seen these errors before. It's telling me that I need to use call deferred. Inside of the load level function, there's quite a few changes while the physics process is still going on. So if I go back down into this function where I actually load the level, I just need to make sure that I add call deferred to the start of it. And when I call a function with this deferred method, I need to wrap it in quotation marks, and the argument gets passed as a second argument in here. If I test this out again and I head to the exit, this time I move to level 2, but there are no errors. And that's already working pretty well, and I don't actually need to print out the level number anymore because I know that we're moving on to the next level. I can see it happening. But it happens really suddenly. And instead, I would like to have some kind of fade transition between levels as well as at the start of the game. For that, I'm going to add another node onto my heads-up display. And this is going to be a color rect node. I'll head over to my 2D view so that I can see this, and it appears here as a little white rectangle. But I'm going to change that to a black rectangle so that the game fades to black in between levels. It's also really small, so let's use this preset up here to fill the entire screen with it. There is a little bit here that's on the outskirts of it, but that's outside of the game window, so we're not going to see that anyway. And then I go into visibility and update this modulate section. The way this fade will work is by just adjusting the transparency. I'll begin with it fully set to 0 so that you can't actually see the black rectangle, but we know it's there. Now I just need to rename this to fade, and I can configure it inside of my script. So first, right at the top of this main script, I need to drag over the fade so that I can access that variable. Then, as soon as the game is loaded inside of this ready function, I'm going to take that fade node and then access the modulate property. And specifically, I'm looking for alpha, which is the transparency, which I will set to 1.0. If I run the game again, you can't actually see anything. And that's because the transparency has been turned off, and all we see is that big black rectangle that covers the entire screen. Now I need a way of adjusting this transparency so that once the game is loaded and the screen is fully black, it slowly fades out by making the rectangle transparent. So I'm going to create another function all the way down at the bottom, which I will put inside its own section called fade. The function is also going to be called fade, and it will take one argument, which is the alpha that I'm targeting. So it's either going to go to full transparency or to no transparency. So the 2 alpha variable is the target that I want to go for. This is going to be a float value. It'll be either 0 or 1.0. And it doesn't return anything, so we'll add void at the end. Now I need a way of going between those two transparencies, and for this I'm going to use a tween. So I will define my tween by calling create_tween. If you've never used tweens before, it's essentially a way of creating a transition between two states. Once I've created this tween variable, I can then assign different properties to it. So let's do that. Let's take this tween and then call tween_property so that we can adjust the property of a node. The node that I want to adjust is my fade node, which is this colored rectangle. And the property that I want to adjust is this modulate, and more specifically, .a, the alpha. So I pass that in here as modulate a. Then I need to tell it the target, which is my toAlpha variable. And lastly, the speed at which I want this tween to move at. So basically how quickly I want that transition to happen. And this is how I can fade in and out. I just need to change the value that I pass in here, either 0 or 1. The tween will then take care of the rest. It will gradually move towards that value by either fading in or fading out. And because this tween is going to take a little bit of time, at the end of it, we want to wait to make sure that it's fully finished. So we await tween. Now let's call this function to get this fade effect. So we head back up into our load level function. And right at the bottom, once we've set everything up, is where we want to fade back in. So essentially we'll fade out, do all of this stuff in the background of deleting the level and resetting the level. And then once we're ready, we will fade back in by targeting an alpha of 0. So let me just add a comment here to say fade in. So let's test this out. We'll start with a black screen and then it fades back in. But now if I go to the next level, let's see what happens at that transition. Well, nothing happened because we never faded back out in between levels. So at the very beginning, when we start to load the level, we need to fade out. So I'll add a comment to say fade out, and then I will call this fade function, but this time I'm passing 1.0. So it's going to full instead of nothing. So let's test this out. Everything starts off correctly. It faded back in nicely, but if I go to the next level, there doesn't seem to be a fade effect. It still just goes straight on to the next level. And that's because these two fades are conflicting with each other. I've got one right here, and then very quickly after, I have another one. I need to wait for them to finish before I call the next one. And I'm going to do that by adding a wait at the beginning of both of these calls. So I'll await before I fade out, and I will await before I fade in. And because I have these inside the function, I will also await on the function itself by adding a wait at the top. So now whenever I call load level, I don't actually need to defer it anymore. If I go back down into this section here, where I was previously calling it deferred to avoid any errors, I don't need to do that anymore. I can just use await. So we'll call the load level function as normal, and we pass in the new level number. So let's test this out again. We start off with the screen fading to black, and then we can move on to the next level. And this time I should get a transition between the two. So we fade out and then fade back in. But the first fade seems to take quite a while to kick in. And the reason for that is that we're actually starting off our first level faded out. So that's confusing things a little bit. When I first load the game, I don't need to fade. So this fade effect should only happen when I change level, but it shouldn't happen on my first level. I'm going to add another argument here inside my load level function, which is going to be first_load, and this will be a boolean. Then my fade can be dependent on this function. So I'll say if not first load, then I will fade out. Basically, if I'm going between levels or if the player has died and I'm resetting the level, then I'll fade. But if this is just the first load of the game, we don't need to do this because we're already faded out. I now need to add this argument wherever I call this function. So right at the start inside my ready function, I don't need to fade out, so I'm going to set this to true because this is the first load of the game. But then whenever I call it subsequently, I will need to pass false because this is no longer the first load. Another thing I need to fix is that when the player dies, we don't actually do anything afterwards. The game just freezes up. So right now inside this function, all I'm doing is killing the player and then printing out that the player is killed. Instead, I'm just going to reset the level. So I'm going to take this function from up here and replace my player killed with it. Now, if I go through and get killed, everything fades out, we reset and start again. But this doesn't reset the score. So if I pick up an apple, my score goes to 1 and then I get killed, everything resets, but my score is still 1, meaning that I can just keep collecting these apples. And I'm actually just going to do that inside of my load level function because this does pretty much everything to configure the level. So I'm going to add a third argument here, which will be reset score. And this will be another boolean. I can then check this argument inside the function. I'll say if reset score, if it's true, then let's set the score to 0. And more importantly, I need to update this score label, which should already be in the function as a score label variable. So I can take that, bring it down here, and say score label dot text is equal to score is equal to 0. I now need to pass this extra argument, and it's going to be false when I first start the level because it's already on 0. But when I call it afterwards, if I've moved on to the next level, then it's still false because I want to preserve the score as the player progresses through the levels. But if the player dies, then it becomes true and I want to reset it back to 0. So I'm going to go and collect this apple and then get killed. Everything fades out, reset to 0, and then we go again. And that just about wraps up the level progression. We can move from level to level, we've got this fade effect, and even when the player gets killed, everything resets back to start. One more thing that I would like to add is having moving platforms to make the level a little bit more dynamic. But before I do that, I'm going to add background music to this game. I'll do that by going into my main root, adding a child node, and this is going to be an audio stream player 2D, which is basically the same as all the sound effects that I've used so far. I'll rename this to music, then I head into my files and drag over this music file into my stream. I want this to start playing as soon as the game begins, so I tick autoplay. There's a whole bunch of settings here that you can play around with, but I'm going to leave it as it is. I don't know if my screen recorder is going to pick it up, but I can hear now that there is background music in the game. Now we can actually create that moving platform. So I'm going to make a new scene, and I'll start off with a 2D node, which I will rename to moving platform. Inside of this node, I'll add a child, which is going to be one that we haven't actually used before, and that's animatable body 2D. This will have physics properties, but it'll be possible to animate some of its properties. So to that, we add a couple of child nodes. The first one being sprite 2D, so that we can have some kind of image, and the second one being collision shape 2D, so that we can have collision between the player and the platform. Now to configure the image, I don't have a specific image that I want to use for just the platform. Instead, I'm going to use my overall terrain tile map. So I'll drag this over into the texture, which gives me the whole thing. But for my platform, I'm actually just going to use this here as my rectangle. And it's possible to crop out a section from this larger image if I select region. Now I can go into edit region, zoom in on what I want to select, and then just fairly roughly select this area. You can see as I do that, these numbers over here are changing. So that gives me the X and Y coordinates where this rectangle starts, and it gives me a width and a height. These aren't precise right now, but I know that this is in multiples of 16, because that's just the size of each of those tiles. That means that I can round these to the nearest 16 by setting that to 96, that to 128, this becomes 48, and that becomes 16. And that gives me a perfect cutout of that platform. But it suffers from the same problem as the other images, where I need to go into texture and change the filter from inherit to nearest. Now I need to add a collision shape to it, and this one's pretty easy. It's just a rectangle. So we add the shape, and then I move around these points to make it exactly the same size as my image. Now that I have this platform, it's going to be completely stationary, so I need a way of animating it. And for that, we add a child node onto the animatable body. This is another one that we haven't used before, which is an animation player. This will allow me to change specific properties of this platform. With the animation player selected, I can then go down here and add a new animation, which I will call move. This will bring up this little section here, but before I can add any animations, I need to choose what property I want to animate, which is going to be the property track. Then I will select my animatable body 2D and search for position. This way I can change the position over time. The boxes at the top here are a timeline. So if I change this to 5 seconds, you'll see that 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4 are now highlighted. So this animation will last 5 seconds. I can then add various keyframes inside the animation. So we'll add one right at the beginning, one kind of halfway through, and then one towards the end. Now I can adjust these keyframes by setting them to specific numbers. So the first one will be exactly at the start, and I don't want to change any properties here. So that is the start point and the start state of my platform. Then about halfway through, at 2.5 seconds, I want this platform to have moved over. So I'm going to set the X property to 80. And then lastly, at the very end, at second 5, I want this to come back to the start. So X coordinate becomes 0 again. So we can test this out by putting the playhead at the beginning, click play, and now I can see this platform moving across and then coming back. I want this to keep moving over and over. So I need to click this button here to loop the animation. I also want it to start as soon as the game begins. So I click the autoplay on load. Now if I click play, the platform is just going to go back and forth. It hits its right-hand side position at this keyframe, goes to the end, and then just loops over and over again. Now we can save this scene inside of my scenes folder as moving platform, and we can add it to one of our levels. The problem is level 1 and level 2 are already pretty busy, so I'm going to create level 3 specifically for these platforms. And here is my level. It's a very simplified version of level 2. I've deleted all the enemies, I've moved around the apples, and I've added in my moving platforms. In the same way as I grouped my apples and my enemies in the previous levels, I've also grouped the platforms inside a node 2D called moving platforms. This way I can access all of them at the same time if I need to. So again, you can copy this level if you like, or you can create your own version and just put the platforms wherever you like. There is a pretty obvious issue, which is the platforms are way too small. So we need to go back in here, select the parent node, and then change the transform scale to 3. So that will make it a lot bigger. Now, if I head back to my level, the platforms look a lot more normal. As a quick recap of how to actually add these platforms onto the level, we would go into the parent here, or if you already have a group like this, and then right click and select instantiate child scene. This gives us all of the scenes we've created so far, and moving platform is in there. This will create a new platform, and I can drag it over to wherever I want it to go. But in this case, I already have the 3 that I want, so I'm going to delete this 4th one. Now I'd like to test this out, but if I run the game, it's going to start on level 1. So I need to run through all of my levels first to get to the one with the platforms. That's a little bit impractical for testing stuff out as I'm working on it. So I'm going to switch to my script, go into my main script, and actually just change the level to level 3. If I run it now, I will immediately start in a level with the platforms. So everything seems to work well. And if I jump on them, the physics properties are working correctly. I can jump on the platforms, the player moves along with them, and everything's working well. So now you've successfully built your very own platformer. You can develop this further by adding more levels, or maybe even different enemies or traps. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this game, and what other games you would like me to make.